Hi there, boys. So this week we're going to try something different from what you might have been doing before. Some of you will have done this already. So this is a little bit of revision for you. We're going to go through the three different parts of your America unit. So talking about the boom, the bust, and then post-war. So today I'm going to talk you through the boom, the years in the 1920s where there was much opportunity for many Americans, but obviously lots of inequality as well. Now, if you have a look at this first picture on this screen, you can see that opportunity and that inequality in a really stark form. The girl in the middle is one of those Little Rock 9 students in 1957 who went to Little Rock High School and were the only 9 black students in that school. Now, it was legal for those students to go to school and they were encouraged to do so, but as you can see by the distaste and perhaps the hatred on some of these white people's faces in the background, not everybody supported those students having the opportunity that everybody else who was of a different colour would have had. Now you can see in the background these men with the helmets on are the National Guard who were sent in by President Eisenhower, and what he does is he sends them in to protect the Little Rock 9 from the abuse that's hurled at them, sometimes vocally and sometimes literal things hurled at them, that we'd class today as bullying or racism towards those poor students. So that comes a lot later in your course, not something we're going to focus on today. Instead, we're going to focus on the boom years. So here on this screen are all the different things that you need to know for your exam about how American people what their lives are like during those 1920s. So take a look at these. You can pause the video and write down anything that stands out to you. Okay, so what you'll need in this lesson is a piece of paper and a pen. If you have a highlighter or a set of colours of highlighters, even better, but they're not necessary, just a pen and some paper. Okay, if you have your exercise book, you could probably even use that. It'd be a really good place to keep all your notes central. At the end of the lesson, we're going to ask you to take a photograph of your notes, or if you have been using a computer, which of course you're welcome to, just send us through what you've done so we can see your notes and see what you've written. Okay, so send that through to your teacher, whether that's myself or the other 2 members of the department. So pause this video, take down any notes you like as and when you see fit. So our plan today then. I want to talk to you about 4 big questions. The first one, what was the economic boom? The second one, the causes of the boom, who benefited and who did not? The third one, the big question, Prohibition. What was it? What did it have to do with alcohol? What were the effects of Prohibition as well? And then finally, what the US government's policy was to do with anyone who was a little bit different, whether they were of a different colour, whether they were from a different country. So those are 4 main questions we're going to ask today in order to help you revise for your boom. Now, first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about what was the boom, a definition of the boom. So here we are in this bit highlighted in blue. Blue will help you out. So we know that it was a period of economic prosperity, of economic wealth in America in the 1920s. So we know this was a time period when lots of Americans had lots of money. They could use it to in any ways they wanted, a little bit like that scene in The Great Gatsby that you'll remember that we played you in Year 9, of big parties, you know, lots of drinking, lots of smoking, lots of fun, girls with short skirts dancing, men having a wonderful time, everything. You know, these people were having lots and lots of opportunities. Okay, now that's one interpretation of the boom, that it was a period of prosperity in America that people were able to benefit from. So I want you to pause this now and then write down what the economic boom was. Okay, use your knowledge to write down details of what that might have looked like for American people. So think back to that Great Gatsby scene where he's driving in a smart new car and he's got a beautiful girl who looks potentially like a flapper sitting next to him. He's driving in, there's lots of parties going on, lots of jazz music blaring from each of the sides of the room. You know, Louis Armstrong might be singing and performing for him. Lots of things are happening that are new and different and exciting. So pause this video now, write down what the economic boom was, and then briefly what that might have looked like for American people. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the causes of the boom. Now let's just dip back to this slide I talked about a minute ago. So one of the causes of the boom was because America was isolating itself. A little bit like what we're doing for coronavirus. The Americans were isolating themselves in the 1920s as well. So during World War I, from 1914 to 1918, the Americans didn't get involved for a little while. So it wasn't until 1917 that they started to get involved. So those 3 years before, they made lots of money. How they did this was through selling supplies to Europe, profiting, and what they started to do was they started to make goods that were made in Germany before, but because Germany was fighting a war, they couldn't make those goods. So America took over that market. That's what it means by monopolize. They took over it, and they became the only producers of those goods. So America were able to make supplies. So pause this video now, and under a subtitle, the causes of the boom, jot down that first fact, and then come back to me, and I'll talk you through some others. Pause now, cause of the boom, new subtitle, jot down this fact. And when you come back to me, we can carry on talking about the boom, which, as a reminder, is a period of prosperity of wealth for America in the 1920s. So our first factor here on this slide is consumer society. Now, if you remember, if you're a consumer, you're somebody who consumes things, who buys things. You want to buy the latest goods. So, for example, in 1916, before the time period that we study starts, only 15% of homes in America had electricity, but in 1927, 70% of homes. That means that you could, if you wanted, you could buy yourself a vacuum cleaner that was powered by electricity, you could buy yourself a dishwasher, you could buy yourself a washing machine, a radio. All these things were previously not available were now available for those Americans. They were able to produce so many more things, and those things were bought by many people, which is going to fuel the economy. Okay, so if you imagine that you're in a family, and the wife in the family needs to it spends a lot of time cleaning clothes. She finds that a washing machine is on offer. What you think is, you think, okay, well, that's going to save that woman, that wife in that family, a lot of money, a lot of time as well, because she's able to use her time more wisely. So you buy that washing machine, and what that does for the wife in the family is that it saves her time, but what it does for the company who are creating the washing machine is it makes them a lot of money, because it encourages them to make more goods that are able to be bought. Now you might have a brand new car, a Ford car, a Model T maybe, and what you'll see advertising on the side of the roads, like these two pictures here. This is Babe Ruth, the famous baseball player, and this here is a diamond seller, a jeweler. Advertising becomes a powerful tool for promoting new products and encouraging trends, and what it does is it targets people. So we'll go back to that situation of that wife who's maybe got her washing machine, but maybe she wants to stop dusting and polishing the floor all the time and save her time a lot more. So she'd be targeted with adverts like those for vacuum cleaners. So you've started to write down your cause of the boom based on the previous slide. Now I'd like you to add to your causes. We've talked about advertising and consumer society. So pause this video and spend a couple of minutes jotting down any additional notes. And you'll find here there are two more here, areas that we're going to talk about. The first one is hire purchase. So I'm going to go back to that story of that woman who was buying her washing machine. Actually, no, I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to talk about a story of somebody who might want to buy a car, because that fits us better in this situation. Now, hire purchase might help them a little bit. What we've got a really expensive goods, like that car. Let's say we're going to pluck a number out of the air. It costs $200 to buy out front. If a family did not have $200 to spend on a car, what they could do is they could choose to use hire purchase, which is a form of credit, which means you're loaning the money really. And what you do is you pay for that car in installments. You buy it now, as it says here, and you pay it later, pay the full money later. So an ordinary family could buy really, really cool things and become consumers because they could afford to buy things in installments. So the sale of cars went through the roof. The sale of clothes, household electronic items as well went through the roof, because people were able to buy things in small sections And as they were paid money every week or every month, they're able to start paying off those installments as they went along. They had access to products that previously would have been completely unaffordable. So what that did was it gave them the opportunity to be consumers, it gave the companies the opportunity to sell more goods, and it helped them to make a heap of money. Now we've got this little comment in brackets here afterwards. Let me just explain that. Now imagine if you are buying a car, you're desperate for that car, so what you do is you start to use hire purchase, but you're not entirely sure you'll be able to pay off those installments. So you ask your bank manager to loan you some money so you can pay off those installments a little bit quicker. When the economic crash happens in 1929, many of those banks start to call back their loans. Now, I don't think in this situation, many of those ordinary people would have been able to pay back those loans. So what they're stuck with is they're stuck with a car that they owe money on, and they're stuck with a loan that they can't pay back to the bank managers as well. So they're stuck in a really, really difficult position, and that makes them much, much worse. So hire purchase, a great idea when you've definitely got the money for it, and you will still have the money for it in the long term. But it's a really, really bad idea if and when that money starts to disappear, or you stop earning money and then you can't pay off the hire purchase chunks. Okay, so if you want to pause the video, do so and jot your notes down about hire purchase, or stay with me and I'll talk about mass production, and you can pause the video once I've gone through everything on this slide. So we're still carrying on talking about Henry Ford and his Model T cars, because they were the first ones that used mass production, or you'll know it as the assembly line. So what happened, if you remember, is instead of taking hours to produce a car, it now took 10 seconds, because each individual person would take on the responsibility of one part of that car. So let's say that one person made the windscreen, another person made the bonnet, somebody else was creating the exhaust, and instead of one or two people creating the entire car, those people would pick up individual skills like exhaust making, like wheel tyre making, and they would just do that again and again and again. So they got very, very good at it, very, very quick at it, and it meant that they could produce cars quickly, in 10 seconds, and they could make the company lots and lots of profit as a result. Now, the company would pay the workers the same amount, but the workers would produce a lot more cars in the time period they had. So that meant the company could make a lot more money. And actually what Henry Ford started to do, as he began to make a lot more money on more profits from his cars and more sales, is he began to pay his workers more too. Now, as it says here, increased car ownership also led to greater freedom. So imagine that somebody in your family has got a car and they hadn't done so before. They'd spent their entire time walking places. Now they can now drive anywhere they like. They can go and buy a house in the suburbs and live out a little bit further away because they can travel much more easily. They can drive out to a holiday destination and spend money in the leisure industry. So that encourages the car industry, then encourages many other industries, for example leisure, to develop too. Babe Ruth, as we mentioned before, many people will be able to go and watch him play in a stadium outside the city centres, which is going to encourage the spreading of that money as people buy hot dogs or tickets as they go to these new places. So once more, pause the video, jot down these two bits of information about what causes the boom to happen, and you'll join me when we move on to talking about how the Republican government start to encourage the boom to happen. So we're going to talk about two political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, to put this into context, Trump is a Republican and Obama was a Democrat. This man in the picture is a man called Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican president in the late 1920s. Now, Herbert Hoover picked up a government which had three main policies. The first policy was this French phrase, laissez-faire. It means literally leave alone. So what the Republicans do, what their policies are to not interfere with businesses, to allow them to make their own decisions and invest their money how they see fit. Now, this means that people like Henry Ford had a freedom to do what they wanted, to develop the assembly line and mass production, and that meant that they could make a lot of money. Another policy of the Republican government was low taxation. So for those new industries that were developing, like the car industry, they did not require many taxes from them. It also, the third and final thing the Republican government did, they did not interfere with people, okay? So we said they didn't interfere with businesses or with taxes, but they also didn't interfere with things like healthcare or civil help and this sort of thing. So if we put this into context of one we know well, Obama developed his healthcare system, didn't he? As a Democrat, he did interfere with people's lives, and he wanted to increase taxes so you could have a healthcare system maybe similar to the NHS. Donald Trump has done the opposite. He has decided not to carry on with Obama's health system because he believes that he should not interfere with people's lives. So those three main policies, laissez-faire, leave alone, low taxation, and no interference from the government, are very much Republican policies. Now, as a result of these policies, they are seen as a party that funds the wealthy, encourages people like Henry Ford to make a lot of money. Okay, now Herbert Hoover was president right at the end of the boom years, so he picked up these three policies at the point when life was starting to change. So he was not ready for that life to start to change because he was going to continue with these three policies, which would work in a period of prosperity, but unfortunately Hoover did not work in the bust years. So pause the video, jot down how the Republican government would also encourage the boom to happen. And now we're going to move on to the second question, which is who benefited from the boom and how did they benefit? Now we're going to talk first of all about businessmen. I want to talk about the stock market. Now the stock market is a market. It's somewhere where you buy and sell things, and what you're buying and selling is shares. A share is a part of a company. So at a stock market, people who are trained will go along and they will buy and sell parts or shares of a company for somebody else. So that means that millions of people start to get involved. What they do is they buy those shares, so parts of companies, and they make money by selling them on. So let's say I bought a share in 1920 for $10. Not a very big share, it's quite a small share of Henry Ford. He makes loads of money because he sells so many Model Ts on his assembly line. Maybe in 5 years that $10 has gone up to $1,000. Brilliant. What I do then is I sell that share and I make the difference between $10 and $1,000. That is money in my pocket. Now once I've done that once, I want to buy some more because I want to make some more money. I don't think making that much difference is enough. So what I do is I then, instead of putting $1,000 in, I then take some money from the bank, and perhaps I put in money from the bank and my own money. Now what I plan to do is I plan to make the same amount of profit as I did from the first investment, and I'll pay the bank loan off. Now this is pretty risky because it suggests that I am confident that the company I've bought a share in is going to make more and more profits as time continues. If that company starts to lose money, then I lose my money because I can't pay the bank back. This is called buying on the margin. It's very risky and not many people do it now because of the risks involved. So this will work well for me as long as prices rise. As soon as prices fall, I'm stuck. So a few numbers for you to show you the change. In 1920, there was 4 million people who owned shares, parts of companies. In 9 years, that had gone up to 20 million. Okay, so many people were doing exactly as I've been saying. Because of the low taxation that we talked about from the Republican government, that meant that businessmen were able to make a lot of money. People with entrepreneurs who had lots of new ideas were able to make lots of money. So we're talking about how people benefited. Well, ordinary people buying shares are able to benefit, and companies, business owners who owned small companies will benefit because they were able to make money through low taxation. Okay, now I said this bit in blue that's highlighted down here is what I was saying before about the risks of buying shares. If you borrow money to invest in businesses, fine, it's okay as long as you can always pay that money back that you've borrowed. As soon as the Wall Street crash happened, when people had no money because everything was going bankrupt, then no one can pay that money back and you're stuck really. So pause this video, jot down how ordinary people and how businessmen and women were benefiting from the boom. And if you pick this back up again with me, we're going to talk about entertainment and how people who worked in the entertainment industry would benefit too. So you will have seen clips in your classes about cinema developing. So Hollywood becoming a massive household name all the way around the world, really. By 1929, we have 110 million cinema tickets sold every single week. Up until 1927, movies were silent, hence why they're called movies. But in 1927, talkies were introduced, so the technologists, the engineers were able to record audio at the same time as recording movement. People wanted to copy the fashions and styles of celebrities. So you've got Charlie Chaplin, Rudolph Valentino, who are on the cinema screen. And what we've got actually is Hollywood becoming a little bit more cautious. So we've got a nudity being banned, and a kiss on screen can only last 3 seconds. People were worried about the moral code being affected by this. So think about this when we talk about Prohibition, when we come back to saying how conservative the Americans were and still are. So one area that's developing, where people are benefiting, is by more access to cinema. Celebrities are making lots of money and making a big name for themselves. Another area that's developing, that's improving, is professional sport. So I've mentioned Babe Ruth before. He was pictured in a previous slide, wasn't he? He played for the New York Yankees. He's one of the highest ranking of scoring baseball players of all time. These people became celebrities because people were able to spend money on them. They're able to travel, as we said before, to stadiums and spend money when they got there. So that encouraged that industry to develop too. So sportsmen developed, ordinary people developed, as they're able to enjoy themselves better watching sports. But they're also able to enjoy themselves listening to jazz. Now, remember we said that radios are one of the electronic things that developed. Remember that radios and jazz are a sign of the 1920s. Make sure that you're really clear that there's a distinction between radios and jazz and in the 1920s, and TV and rock and roll, which happened in the 1950s and 1960s. Please make sure you make that distinction, because that's something that's very, very easy to mix up. Okay, so back to the topic. Jazz music, jazz musicians such as Louis Armstrong, as well as others, are becoming more and more famous. You've got Josephine Baker. She is famous for performing in Paris. She becomes a household name, moves back to America, and you might recognise her banana dance. If you don't, have a look. Open up another tab on YouTube and see if you can find it. It's wild. So, jot down, once you've read through this and once you listen to what I've said, who else is benefiting from the boom and how are they benefiting. Remember, you can talk about the individuals who are involved and also the more ordinary people who are benefiting from this too. Once you're ready, we're going to move on to who did not benefit. So we've got 4 key areas on this slide, and I'm going to talk you through African Americans on the next slide. These are the people who saw inequality in this period, okay, who did not benefit from the boom. Our first group is the immigrants, the old industry workers. These people are often the lowest paid jobs. If you remember when we talked about the Irish migration from back in year 7, they moved to America, and many of them worked in the pits to dig coal out of the ground. These are terrible, low-paid jobs. They often didn't have a chance to education, and that also became worse as industrialization happened. So we've got old industries such as wool, cotton, and coal left the old industry workers with nothing to earn money, and no way to earn their money. So those people were suffering. Native Americans are completely overlooked, a generation that seem to get completely pushed out of most government decisions and history books. Unfortunately, many of them are pushed onto reservations of really, really tiny areas of land, which means that they don't have anywhere to raise their cattle, their buffalo, to roam around, which is what they're very much used to. And what that leads to is huge unemployment and massive deprivation, social deprivation, cultural deprivation and economic deprivation. They suffer in many, many ways. And sadly, as I said before, many, hugely overlooked by many governments over the years. Now, farmers, there's a big problem of overproduction. So what farmers are doing is, in this period, is they're producing more and more and more. However, the demand for what they're growing is not growing at the same rate as how much they're producing. So they're producing too much of goods such as wheat, and not everybody wants to buy that wheat. This is because it comes cheaper from places like Canada, so farmers are not able to sell it. That means that they are not going to be able to make money because their goods are not so valuable. Their wheat, their lamb, their beef is not so valuable. They also have another problem which is not mentioned here. I'm just going to type it in here. I'm going to type in Dust Bowl, because this should be on our list as well. Now, if you remember, the Dust Bowl was a huge problem that meant that farmers could not grow anything anyway in some parts of central Southern America. So states such as Oklahoma, they were suffering huge drought, which means there wasn't very much rainfall, which means that the top layer of soil, what we call the topsoil, because it's at the top and it's soil, it's a very inventive name there. What happened to that was, because of the strong winds and because of the lack of rain, it just blew away. So the farmers lost the grain that was buried in the topsoil, ready to grow, and they lost that fertile topsoil, which provided the nutrients with which they needed to grow crops such as wheat and barley, and so on. So overproduction caused farmers to lose money. The Dust Bowl meant they couldn't grow anything. So those two problems, very different in their impact, in their origins, were the same in their impact. They meant the farmers lost a lot of money. African Americans, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what was happening for them, but just briefly, here's an overview. Jim Crow laws, you'll remember from your civil rights section of this unit, were unofficial laws that were named after a cartoon character, Jim Crow, who mocked African Americans. What those laws did is they meant that they created a situation for African Americans where they had inequality throughout the workplace. They were discriminated against in a very racist way. They did not have equal opportunities. They could not intermarry. Many of them couldn't vote. They couldn't get decent jobs. Their lives were pretty terrible. So pause this video now and write down for me who did not benefit from the boom, and a little bit of a brief explanation for how they didn't benefit. You can use these notes to help you. Then we're going to come on to African Americans in a little bit more detail. Okay, so adding to your information about African Americans, we've mentioned about Jim Crow laws. People really thought that as of 1863, when slavery itself was abolished by Lincoln in what he called the Emancipation Proclamation, a speech that said slaves are no longer, they are not a thing anymore. What happened instead is people in southern states were really worried that this would encourage blacks to just go wild. And they would take all their jobs, and they were really worried that that would stop them from being able to live the lives that they'd grown accustomed to. So the Jim Crow laws were put in place to try and stop the white Americans' lives from changing. So what that looked like is it looked like segregation. So you've got this picture here, we wash for white people only. That's a good example of segregation. So every part of life for a black African American was different to the white people. The idea was that it was separate and equal. However, as you know from your civil rights unit, that was not the case. We say it's inferior or unequal to whites, not as good as the options that were given to whites. Another area where black Americans suffered was literacy tests. They were designed to be really difficult so that nobody could pass, and all that did was it prevented them from being able to vote and vote in somebody into Washington who made the laws, who was going to be kind to them and think about their lives as well as the white Americans. Up here, you'll recognise these men, or potentially even women, as people from the Ku Klux Klan. These people were determined that what they were doing was the right idea. They based their ideas on this film called The Birth of a Nation, which justified the treatment of the African men and women by the KKK, because it showed the KKK as heroes defeating the evil black men. Obviously, a terrible video that we want to question. But what is clear here is the Ku Klux Klan were being extraordinarily violent and discriminatory towards the black Americans. Now, let's say a black American has a horrible crime put to them. They may go to court and try and put their case across. However, at that trial, they might be sitting in front of a jury who is all white, and likely in the southern states at the very least to be white racists. Now, they of course are not going to side with the black Americans. They are going to side on the white American side, even if it is clear that the white person is not innocent and the black person is the one who's innocent. It would be really, really unlikely for the black person to get off with the crime. So essentially what the black African Americans realised, but it was no point in actually taking their case to court because they knew it would never go in their favour. I've mentioned a few times that in the South life was worse. Well, yes, nearly 2 out of 12 million African Americans who lived in the South left that area and went to go and live in northern cities. Now, many of those people went to Chicago, which is why Martin Luther King in 1968 focused some of his campaign just before he died on the problems that people faced in Chicago. Now, have a look at this video. You might have to type it out by hand into YouTube to see some rare footage of a town that was predominantly made up of black Americans. Once you've done so, come back to this slide and then pause this video to jot down a little bit more information about how African Americans were not benefiting. You can talk about anything on this side, including the lynching, the terrible treatment that they faced. And then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a slightly more complex case, women. So we're going to ask the question, how far did women benefit, and decide which part of that balance should the women fall into? Should they fall into benefit side or the not benefit? Well, let's dive straight in. So these three women that you can see on the slide are flappers. They are young, fashionable women who have the latest trends and styles. You can see their bob haircuts. You can see their short dresses that are quite sheer at the top. If they went longer, if the photo was longer, you'd be able to see that the skirt stopped above the ankle, which was shocking for this generation. This generation of women had much more freedom than their predecessors. They were able to travel by themselves. They didn't necessarily need a male member of their family to go with them. This was partly because of that changing attitude, but also because of the role played by World War I. Now, if you remember, we talked about World War I in Year 8, and we said that many of those, when we talked about the suffragettes actually, when the men went to war, the women took over their roles. Well, the same thing happened in America. What those women were able to prove was that they were worthwhile spending money on. They were also just as good at doing the jobs that previously were only thought to be acceptable as men's jobs. So they proved themselves and they gained confidence about wanting to make a change. However, this is our clause here where we're saying which side of the fence we put women, because so far we said positive things about those women, but we know, as it's highlighted in blue here, that not all women benefited from these changes. We know that most working class women still worked in low paid jobs as well as raising children. Many of them could not afford the washing machines that I was mentioning earlier, and therefore their lives were still taken up by slow and long tasks just to keep their home in check, cleaning the floors, cleaning the clothes and so on. I mentioned before that we would speak about how conservative America was. Well, here's another example, the Anti-Flirt League. Many women were opposed to the flappers who brought in much of these new latest trends and styles. We know that women were still not equal to men in the 1920s, in the home or in the workplace, despite these changes. We could even say in 2020, women are not equal to men, but that's another conversation. So pause this video and I want you to answer this question here. How far did women benefit from the boom? Were they part of the generation who did benefit, like the businessmen and most ordinary people, or would we categorise them alongside the Native Americans and the African Americans? So pause this, answer question in the yellow box, please. And now we're going to talk about the last two big questions. First one is prohibition. Now, if you remember, prohibition is all about the sale of alcohol. It's brought in 1920, and what it does is it bans alcohol. So you can write down this question, and you can write down the answer, which is in 1920, prohibition was the banning of alcohol. You were not allowed to drink, to produce, or to sell alcohol. Our next question is, why was it introduced? Well, it was introduced because of the conservative nature of Americans. We've got a group called the Anti-Saloon League. Now, if you remember, a saloon is like the American word for bar or pub. They don't use the word pub in America really, so their equivalent is saloon. So the anti-pub, anti-bar league. Now, we've also got another group called the Christian Temperance Movement. Now, if you're Christian, obviously your motivations are going to be around what you think God would like. For temperance, if you show temperance, you are calm and collected and never do things to extremes. So these people think that alcohol doesn't make you temperate, it makes you wild and not very calm. So these two groups put pressure on the government to ban alcohol because they think it was the cause of society's moral failings. Now, lots of people make the claim that men who earn their weekly wage will go straight to the saloon on the way home from their work, and they'll spend away the money they've earned on beer in those saloons. And they say, well, actually, if the society was more moral, the men would take that money and take it straight back to their wives and their families, and they'd be able to put shoes on their children and buy educational books for their children to make sure that they had a better opportunity for their lives in the future. So these groups, the Anti-Saloon League, the Christian Temperance Movement, said that it was alcohol was a bad idea because it caused society to fail morally. So pause this video right now and jot down why it was introduced. And now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the consequences. So if you put another little subtitle, the consequences of prohibition, then we can talk through the main consequences. And the first one is that we have policemen who are called prohibition agents. Now, they're people who are paid to make sure that people follow the law, to enforce the law, but they struggle for a number of reasons. The first one is because of how big America is and how many borders they have. Now, if you look at America on a map, it's got a huge border on the north with Canada and a huge border on the south with Mexico. Now, if you were somebody who was desperate to make some money at this time, and we're going to look at Al Capone in a minute, who was one of those people who was desperate to make money, you would probably go and speak to somebody you knew who lived on the border and get them to smuggle alcohol from one side of the border to the other. Those people were called bootleggers because what they did is they put the alcohol bottles into the boots and walked from one side of the border to the other. You've also got 18,000 miles of coastline. Now that's going to be really, really difficult for those prohibition agents, those policemen, to check. They're not going to be able to see every coastline, to check every boat and see whether it's able to and check the contents. You've also got speakeasies. Now, speakeasy is a bar that pops up underground, perhaps hidden around the corner, down an alleyway that you wouldn't necessarily spot if you were new to the city. They were hidden, they were secret, they were in people's basements, and they were not necessarily publicised at all. So not many people knew about these speakeasies because they were illegal, they were secret bars. And what they did was they showed that people were not willing to give up on alcohol. The American government brought in a ban that people did not want to actually follow. People still wanted to have a little drink at the end of the day. People still wanted to have a party and have alcohol there. You imagine that Great Gatsby without alcohol. It just wouldn't be the same party. So people were not willing to give out drink. Now, these people were going to speakeasies, potentially drinking alcohol that they picked up from bootleggers, and the alcohol itself was called moonshine, if you remember. Another consequence of Prohibition was these gangsters. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Al Capone and the role he played in as a consequence of Prohibition. He made a huge profit by selling drink, leading America into a more and more strengthened organised crime area. Now, to close this little section, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was our president from 1932, and one of the first things he did in the first few months of 1933 was he repealed the act. What that means is he ended Prohibition. So as of 1933, alcohol was legal again. So it was only illegal for 13 years from 1920 to 1933. So pause this video, and what you're going to do is you're going to jot down quickly what the consequences were of Prohibition. I've got a couple more on the next slide for you. So the first thing is that it was really difficult to enforce. You've got the information here, and you're going to talk about gangsters being a result of Prohibition as well, a consequence of Prohibition. So pause this video now, write down your consequences. And we're going to carry on talking about consequences with this man here, Scarface, or Al Capone. Now, he had a gang in Chicago that benefited hugely from Prohibition because what they did was they spread alcohol illegally across the whole country on a massive scale. What they did was they also bribed corrupted police officers or Prohibition agents and lawmakers and all this sort of thing on every single level. And all that did was it gave them more and more and more control, so they were able to make more and more money. Another consequence of Prohibition was it turned ordinary Americans who wouldn't normally break the law into lawbreakers. So they were just not willing to accept that they weren't allowed to drink alcohol. Al Capone and his rival gang, Bugs Malone, was led by Bugs Malone. They had this shootout on St. Valentine's Day, which is the 14th of February. And what happened there was Bugs Malone sent in some of his gang members to try and disrupt his rival gang so that he could continue to make lots of money in Chicago. Now, that was a massacre because Bugs' agents were people, his gang members, were massacred where they were killed, and that meant that he was never able to rival Al Capone again. Now, Al Capone was really difficult to catch. If you remember, he was only caught at the end through some tax dodging schemes. He was never caught for murders and selling alcohol. He eventually did go to prison, but not for the reason that many people thought he should be there for. So pause this video, continue to jot down your consequences of Prohibition. And then together we're going to talk about the final thing in this lesson, in this revision lesson, on the boom for America. So this is all about immigration. Okay, we're going to find out what the government's policy was. So GVT is my shorthand, and by that I mean government. We're going to find out what their policy was towards immigration. So we know that America had been a melting pot because we've studied it. We've looked at Irish migration, but at the same time we knew that Italians were migrating and Japanese and Germans were also migrating alongside Chinese and all sorts of other people into America. This is because up to 1900 they had an open door policy, which meant that anybody could come in as long as they could support themselves. They were totally fine. Now, from like 1920 onwards, we have a group called the WASPs. Now, that stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Well, they become prejudiced towards Eastern and Southern Europeans arriving because they were not Protestants. Instead, many of them were Catholic, and they were not strictly, and they're in the WASP's eyes, white because they were Southern European, Italian, perhaps with slightly darker, more Mediterranean skin. So these WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were prejudiced towards many of the others who came to America more recently, who were not English, and could not speak English, and often were Catholic. We know through our study of the Irish that immigrants saw America as a land of opportunity. We know that through our study of migration too. And many want to move there for employment opportunities and to own their own home. They thought that there was much more opportunity there than there would have been back home. So, as a result of some of this prejudice that was becoming more common, there were 3 different things that were introduced. You've got them highlighted in blue here. to try and limit the amount of people who moved into America. So in 1921 we have a quota law. A quota is like another way for saying a cap and a limit to numbers. So they limited the number of immigrants who are allowed to come into America to 350,000. 3 years later, another act further limited that. They said in total no more than 150,000 could come in. Okay, so as we're going through here, pause it at any time you want to jot down what the government's policy was towards immigration. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Red Scare, which is the last bit here. Now the Red Scare, you'll know, is about the fear of communism. Red, because that's usually the colour of the communist flag, and scare to mean fear. Now this is made worse by what happens in 1917. Now Russia has a revolution. They now have a communist government, which is to stand until roughly 1990. And what that does is it encourages Americans to be fearful. There have been a large number of Russian immigrants who'd come into America who thought that, oh, they don't want to be a part of the communist world, so they brought their fear of communism with them, and that encourages Americans to be more scared. Now there's a senator, he's called Palmer, and he carries out some raids. So what he does is he searches around in America and tries to find communists and kicks out whoever he finds. He doesn't find very many, but there's a really famous case of Sacco and Vanzetti. That's these two men here, the picture that you can see. Now they're two Italian immigrants. They come to America to make money, and they are doing so. Now they're accused of a crime, but we can quite easily understand that they were not there. They were not guilty at all, because they were, first of all, not in the same place as the murder happened. They were hundreds of miles away. We can analyse the bullets that were found in the body of the person who died, and they did not come from either of the weapons that these two men owned, so we know that it was somebody else. So if we can establish that those two men were executed wrongly because they were innocent, we then need to work out why we think they were executed. Now, people thought that they were communist. They also had gone to anarchist rallies. Now, an anarchist is somebody who dislikes any kind of organisation of power. So essentially, they are anti-government. So the reasons why these two men were executed was part of the reason because they were anarchists, part of the reason is because people worried about them being communists, but also because they were not WASPs. They were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They would have been Catholic, and they absolutely wouldn't have had English as their first, their mother tongue, their first language, because they're Italian. So this is a really good example, a horrible story, but a good example of the intolerance that many people face when they move to America, and how unwilling the American government was to welcome people from different backgrounds into their country. So you can watch this YouTube video at the bottom. Again, you'll need to pause this and type it straight into your browser to find out a little bit more about the Sacco and Vanzetti case. So now that I've just gone through the government policy towards immigration, pause this video, jot down anything you can that tells you about what the government might do to stop these people from living a normal life. And once you've finished, thank you and well done for getting the whole way through this lesson. What I'd like you to do is to show us what you've done, is to take a photograph of your work and upload it to Show My Homework, or just email it through to one of your teachers and we can just see that you've done your work. If you have any questions, feel free to put a comment into Show My Homework or email one of us, but preferably Show My Homework because it all keeps it in one place and we can help you a little bit easier that way. So well done for getting this far. Please let us know how it's gone and whether you think it's been more useful than a normal worksheet based lesson. Okay, well done boys.